What if I told you that not all Gospels made it into the Bible? That the version of Christianity you know is the result of choices made behind closed doors by emperors and bishops, not prophets and apostles? What if sacred voices were silenced, not because they were false, but because they were inconvenient? This is not just history, it is the story of a faith edited by power. In the year 325 AD, one of the most pivotal events in Christian history occurred: the Council of Nicaea, convened by Emperor Constantine. It was not a spiritual gathering. It was political. Constantine had recently converted to Christianity, or at least aligned himself with it. But the empire he ruled was fractured by theological disputes. Who was Jesus? Was he fully divine, fully human? Both the debates were fierce. Different regions had different answers. Some Christians followed Arius, who claimed that Jesus was created by God and not co-eternal with him. Others followed Athanasius, who insisted Jesus and God were of the same essence. But the council wasn't just about resolving theology. It was about consolidating control. Constantine wanted unity, uniformity, order, a single empire with a single church under a single creed. So the bishops debated, voted, and issued the Nicene Creed, a theological formula that would become the foundation of orthodoxy. But not all voices were included, and not all Gospels were welcome. Parallel to the formal canon, other writings were circulating: the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip. These texts didn't always align with what was becoming official. They emphasized inner enlightenment over institutional authority, personal experience over priestly mediation, a mystical Christ rather than a political one. And that was dangerous, because you can't control a faith that lives in the heart. Maybe you've felt it, that tension between what you've been taught and what your spirit senses is missing. You've heard the official story, but something in you whispers, there's more. That whisper is not heresy, it's hunger, and you are not alone. For centuries, believers have wrestled with the weight of a standardized faith, and the longing for something deeper. Maybe you've sat in church and felt nothing, not because you lack faith, but because your faith is being starved. What if the fullness of Jesus can't be confined to one version? What if the Gospels that were cut out still carry light? The Council of Nicaea drew lines in the sand, and those outside the lines were lost to history. But now they are being rediscovered, not just as ancient curiosities, but as sacred echoes, voices that refuse to be silenced. And if you lean in, you might just hear them, not as noise, but as a call. Not to abandon your faith, but to awaken it. Imagine discovering that parts of your Bible were chosen not for their truth, but for their usefulness, and that others equally ancient, equally profound, were thrown into the fire, not because they lied, but because they questioned. This is not fiction. It's history. After the Council of Nicaea, the Church didn't just define orthodoxy, it began to enforce it. With the empire's blessing, the Church had the power to shape the canon and erase whatever didn't fit. In 367 AD, Bishop Athanasius wrote a letter listing the 27 books that now formed the New Testament. For the first time, a complete canon was declared. But even that list wasn't final. Debates raged for centuries. The Shepherd of Hermas was once read in churches across the empire. The Epistle of Barnabas was cherished by early Christians. The Apocalypse of Peter was cited alongside Revelation, but they were cut. Why? Because they were too mystical, too symbolic, too inclusive, too uncertain. And others, like the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of the Egyptians, and the Gospel of Truth, were not just excluded, they were condemned, declared heretical, dangerous, forbidden. So what did the Church do? They burned them. Monasteries were ordered to destroy scrolls. Scribes stopped copying certain texts, and slowly, the memory of those Gospels faded, but not entirely. Buried in the sands of Egypt and hidden in caves, some of those forbidden texts survived, waiting. We live in an age of access, but we've inherited a faith shaped by restriction. The Bible you hold is a miracle, but it's not the whole story. There were other voices, other witnesses, other visions of Jesus. What if the Gospel of Mary could teach us about courage? What if the Gospel of Philip could heal our wounds about intimacy and holiness? What if the Gospel of Thomas could awaken our spirit to the divine within? These were not threats to faith. They were invitations to go deeper, but they were silenced. They burned the books, but not the truth. Because truth doesn't die in fire. It rises from the ashes, and maybe you were never meant to read just one story. Maybe your soul longs for the voices that were lost. The pages they burned may hold the keys to the questions you're still asking, and those questions, they are sacred. What if the greatest threat to power is a question? What if seeking truth was once considered rebellion? For centuries the church claimed to be the guardian of truth, but it often feared the very thing it claimed to protect, knowledge. The early followers of Jesus were curious. They asked, they challenged, they wrestled with mysteries. Jesus himself answered questions with more questions. He praised seekers. He honored hunger. But over time, that freedom was replaced with fear. As church structures solidified, questioning became dangerous, not because it led to heresy, but because it led to freedom. Thinkers like Origen, who taught about pre-existence and the eventual restoration of all souls, were later condemned. Women who taught, prophesied, and led communities were erased from the records. Monks and mystics who claimed visions outside the institution were silenced or exiled. The church began to define faith not by wonder, but by obedience. To question was to doubt. To doubt was to rebel. But what if questioning is holy? Many apocryphal texts were filled with questions. The Gospel of Thomas doesn't narrate events, it records sayings, riddles, invitations to seek. It begins not with a creed, but with a promise. Whoever discovers the meaning of these words will not taste death. But that kind of promise threatens a system built on control. If salvation is found through inner discovery, then external control loses power. So curiosity was demonized, mystery was banned, and the hunger for knowledge was labeled as sin. Maybe you've been told that asking too many questions is dangerous, that your doubts make you weak, that your desire to know more is a lack of faith. But what if your questions are sacred? What if your doubts are seeds? What if the hunger you feel is the Spirit leading you into deeper truth? The institutional church often feared knowledge because it couldn't control where it would lead. But Jesus never said, "Be quiet and obey." He said, "Ask, seek, knock." And every time you do, something sacred stirs. You weren't made to repeat answers. You were made to explore mysteries. The fear of knowledge still lingers. But knowledge is not the enemy of faith. It is its fuel. The Spirit is not intimidated by your curiosity. It moves through it, and the questions they try to silence might be the very doorways to your awakening. You are not wrong for wondering. You are not broken for seeking. You are sacred. And so are your questions. What if your faith was shaped less by revelation and more by regulation? What if doctrines were chosen not just by saints and scholars, but by strategy and control? The story of Christianity isn't just about what was believed, it's about what was allowed. As Christianity expanded throughout the Roman Empire, so did its influence and its politics. By the time of Emperor Theodosius in the late 4th century, Christianity was declared the official state religion. That meant power. But power demands predictability, so faith had to be systematized. The mystical, open-ended spirituality of Jesus' earliest followers was transformed into a fixed structure. Creeds replaced conversation. Dogmas replaced discovery. The Nicene Creed but became the litmus test for orthodoxy. Questions outside its bounds were condemned. The church began regulating not just belief but behavior. Salvation was mediated through sacraments. Forgiveness required clergy. Access to scripture was restricted. The sacred became institutional. The mystery became formula, and the wildfire of early Christianity became a carefully controlled flame. Have you ever felt boxed in by your faith? Like the God you were taught is smaller than the one your heart longs for. Maybe it's because your faith was standardized. Maybe you inherited rules when you needed relationship. Traditions when you needed transformation. God is not a system. He is a presence. But systems can be easier to manage. And institutions often prefer obedience over intimacy. You were not created to fit into a religious mold. You were created in the image of a God who was living, breathing, wild, and free. The early followers of Jesus didn't memorize creeds. They lived resurrection. And maybe that's what you're being called back to. Not a faith defined by lines, and labels, but a faith alive with wonder. Standardized faith may feel safe, but it can also suffocate. Jesus didn't come to establish an institution. He came to awaken the soul, and the Spirit still moves where it will not according to rules, but according to love. You don't need a standardized faith. You need a living one that breathes, one that grows, one that dares to ask. What was lost when we made faith into a formula? What if silence wasn't absence, but intention? What if the truths that could have changed everything were buried on purpose? The church didn't simply forget the apocryphal gospels, it erased them, not because they were false, but because they threatened control. By the 5th century, Christianity had become the official religion of the Roman Empire. No longer the faith of the oppressed, it was now the faith of the powerful. With imperial favor came structure, wealth, and influence. And with influence came the need for control. The church evolved into a political institution. Bishops held not only spiritual authority but political power. Doctrines weren't merely spiritual truths, they were tools of governance. Voices that deviated from official teaching weren't just debated, they were destroyed. The Gospel of Mary taught that revelation came through inner wisdom. The Gospel of Philip hinted at a sacred bond between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. The Gospel of Thomas pointed believers toward the divine within. These weren't attacks on Jesus. They were invitations to a deeper understanding of him, but a faith centered on personal revelation is dangerous to institutions. It can't be taxed, it can't be tamed, it can't be ruled. So, rather than engage, the church eliminated. Scrolls were burned, teachings banned, communities branded heretical were wiped from memory. Diversity of thought was silenced in the name of unity, but that unity came at a cost. The loss of spiritual depth. Faith was trimmed to fit the mold of power, and truth was sacrificed to preserve authority. What parts of your faith have you been told to suppress? What questions have you buried because someone said that's dangerous? Maybe your spirit has sensed it, the tension between what is taught and what is true. That tension isn't rebellion, it's calling. Systems resist seekers. They fear the ones who won't settle for second-hand faith. But Jesus never asked for silent followers. He called for disciples who would walk, question, and awaken. You may have been taught to stay quiet, to not ask, to just accept, but the Spirit of God does not dwell in silence born of fear. It moves in voices that dare to speak, and maybe the voices they tried to silence were the very ones meant to lead you home. The power that silences truth didn't die with ancient empires. It still echoes through pulpits, institutions, and traditions, but the whisper of the Spirit is louder than their silence, and if you listen closely you'll hear it, not in decrees, not in dogma, but in the quiet courage of a question. You don't need permission to search. You don't need approval to awaken. Because truth doesn't need a pulpit, it needs a heart brave enough to believe there's more. They told us there was only one gospel, one truth, one way to believe, but history tells another story. A story of voices buried, books burned, and truths erased not by accident, but by design. In this chapter we uncovered the strategies of silence that shaped the faith we inherited, and now we must ask, what else have we yet to remember? In Scene 1, we traveled to the Council of Nicaea, where political unity became more important than spiritual diversity. Books like the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Mary were dismissed not for heresy, but for independence. Scene 2 revealed how the church burned the forbidden books, erasing alternative perspectives and declaring only one version of truth as valid. In Scene 3, we explored the fear of knowledge, how curiosity was punished, mystery condemned, and spiritual awakening replaced by obedience. Scene 4 showed how faith was standardized, prayers became formulas, encounters became institutions, and the church built walls around a gospel that once set hearts on fire. And in Scene 5, we faced the hardest truth. Power silences what it cannot control. The Gospels were not lost. They were locked away, hidden under centuries of dogma. But they are rising again, and with them, the voice of a Jesus who calls not just for belief, but for transformation. If this chapter stirred something in you, a question, a longing, a flame, Don't let it go out. Like this video if your faith has ever felt too small for your soul. Comment below which banned gospel are you most curious to read. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the truths that history tried to silence. Share this with someone who is ready to walk beyond the walls of religion into a deeper, freer, bolder kind of faith, and follow us on for daily seeds of spiritual awakening. Because what they tried to hide, we were born to uncover. You have seen the silence. You have heard the whispers from the dust. Now comes the choice. Stay safe in the version you were given, or seek the fullness they tried to bury. The Church of Rome silenced voices, but the Spirit never stopped speaking. Maybe it is speaking to you now. Maybe that restlessness you feel is holy. And maybe you were never meant to just believe. Maybe you were meant to remember. What if hidden in a desert cave lay a library of secrets? What if scrolls sealed for nearly 2,000 years contained the key to what was lost? And what if the truths they carry could change everything you thought you knew? Because deep in the sands of Egypt, something was uncovered, something forbidden, something sacred.